Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to another Kepler Live. And today, our guest is not only a teacher at Kepler, but our very own president. So Scott Postma, welcome. We get to be next to each other.
Hey, thanks, Joffrey. It's good to be next to you.
It is, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm actually really excited about this. We're both large men. And so we stepped in front of one camera, and our elbows are definitely touching the whole time. Yep.
Hey, it's like COVID.
Yeah, that's right. We're shaking hands. It's a new handshake. But we're here to talk humanities. We're here to talk humanism. We're here to talk subject integration. There are a lot of things that we could talk about for our hour together. So welcome to everybody. The way this works is that as we talk, you guys are very welcome to throw comments and questions in there, and we will both interact with them as they come in, but also we'll have a little Q&A session at the end. So let's go ahead and get this started. Since meeting you, just not very long ago, an expression that I came to realize you used often was the term Christian humanism.
Yes.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about why this is a thing for you. I think you focus on.
Yeah, well, I think Christian humanism, obviously goes all the way back to the incarnation. But I specifically use the phrase or the terminology quite often, I guess really in a hope to kind of revive its use and its thoughtfulness. Today, when we think of humanism, the very first question or the very first thing that comes to people's mind is secular humanism.
Right.
And so I get questions often. I even have in my profile a Christian humanist, and so when people say, well, what is that? I mean, how can those two words, those seem, contrary to each other? That's a paradox. How can you use Christian humanism? And so it's a good opportunity to have conversation, and it's a good opportunity to kind of revive what really the secularists have stolen from Christianity. And so it's a very marked expression to push back against this idea. So a lot of what we see in humanism today that we might think of as helping human flourishing, but from a secular standpoint, was actually robbed or lifted from Christianity. So they want the benefit, but they don't want the incarnation. They don't want the gospel. Right.
Yeah, and it's interesting how often movements within the church, Christian movements, will they'll target something as something that needs to be redeemed or claimed, but you're not doing that so much as saying that this ought to be reclaimed. It's been stolen, which I think actually would change how you implement and how you present it to Christians.
Sure. Well, I think it's going to require an education. All right. It's going to require people to get back to reading the great books, reading the literature that brought about Christians who were engaged in the great conversation and really shaped all of Western tradition. I mean, much of what we have in the modern world that gives us the ethos that our nation has, the good that the Western tradition that's represented in the Western tradition that we have today comes from this Christian humanist idea. I'm going to read a definition here just because it's easier to work with.
Yeah.
But Christian humanism is the belief that human freedom, individual conscience, and unencumbered rational inquiry are compatible with the practice of Christianity. Actually, it's even intrinsic in its doctrine. So it represents a philosophical union of Christian faith and classical humanist principles. It's a way of thinking in terms of how faith and reason are rightly aligned with each other, not in opposition to each other.
So that makes me want to ask, since we've gotten this definition, how would you define humanism in the first place? Like, obviously you can't define anything apart from Christ.
Sure,
if you right, but so let's define just the term humanism, so maybe we can understand what Christian humanism is better.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things to think about. Humanism is usually focused on letters. So men and women of letters, people who have written, who are interacting with the great ideas that are thinking about human flourishing.
Mhm.
So we're talking about, what does justice look like? What is justice? What is liberty? What is goodness? What is evil? Those who are asking these questions, writing about these questions, in conversation with these questions, are often thought of as humanists. So what are the best political, what are the best laws, because we're political animals, if we use Aristotle's, terminology. And so a humanist is someone who's thinking about human flourishing, and all the ideas that are associated with that. Writing, it's typically in a republic of letters where this is interacted with. And our universities are typically the place where this is, traditionally has been held up.
So where you would separate a philosopher, say, from a humanist is the concern for human flourishing.
Correct.
You could be a philosopher who's completely detached and disinterested in the well-being of others.
Well, you could be. I suppose you could be, but that would be in some ways the same way a humanist today, separates, in an attempt to be secular, separates from the very root and origin of humanism. So philosophy in and of itself, you could philosophize for the sake of conceptual knowledge, and I just, because I want to know,
Right.
better. But even that is a human interest, right? The fact that we desire to know. Aristotle says that's one of the things that separate us from the animals. Animals want to eat and procreate and survive, but human beings ask why. Not just how, we ask why. So even philosophy, a philosopher is going to be in some way rooted. It's difficult to divorce philosopher from what human.
But it's difficult for you, I think. I think we're seeing some of your perspective here as a humanist and as a Christian humanist, because there are philosophers out there who try to debase man, who try to say that the only truth in life is eat and procreate.
Sure.
Right. Which, even calling that philosophy is disappointing.
Sure. Well,
but they're in philosophy departments.
Right. Absolutely. So you're talking, your nihilist or your deconstructionist,
yes.
and some of these who are trying to, to determine what is a human being. Now, what they're doing is they're coming to the conclusion that that's all we are. We're materialists, right? And so reclaiming the idea of using Christian, it's really redundant, to be honest. Okay, to say Christian humanist, okay, because a true humanist is going to be Christian. So by saying Christian humanist, we're trying to reclaim something that has been, taken. So, if Nietzsche is going to use philosophy, and talk about this, this nihilism we're all, inevitably going to face unless we have our Ubermunch. What he's done is he's lifted the ideas and the principles of philosophy and used them, to that end. But by calling it Christian humanism, we're reclaiming the whole reason we philosophize.
Right.
Why do we read imaginative literature? Why do we, philosophize? Why do we study history? Why do we write? Why do we think? Why are these things happening? Why do we participate in these? So we're trying to recover this.
What about the line of thought that might say that, as God is exalted, there's a suggestion, I suppose, among some Christians that there's an inverse relationship, right? A sort of warm theology, we might say, where, as I exalt God, the smaller I and the smaller humans become. And so why would I be a Christian humanist when I should be a theologian, right? When we should study God.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So this is a fantastic point. And I think this is where some of your, the Petrarchan or Italian Renaissance humanists, where they got it wrong, and where maybe some of your Northern humanists at the same time got it right, Erasmus, and even more in Luther and Calvin, and these are having discussions about it. But there is a theology that when we exalt God, as you talk about, that debases human beings. But a humanist would say, well, the whole point of theology is to understand God, but part of understanding God is his redemptive work, and his redemptive work of creating human beings who live here on this earth in a redeemed state. Obviously we have the future hope of the resurrection and all that comes with it, but we are here for a reason, and so Christian humanists put man in the perspective where he actually belongs. Okay, so yes, we're debased by the fall, but what about redemption?
Yeah.
What's the purpose of redemption? If we're not we've got justification, we also have sanctification. So what about that? That plays a part in our, Christian humanism.
And this is where Christian humanism touches the incarnation, right?
Exactly.
Because, here, humanity is exalted,
Correct.
restored to its place, exalted past its previous place. Like, however you want to think about it, humans are exalted. And the how and why of that is surely worthy of study.
Absolutely. And that is in Christ alone, because of Christ. And he really represents, we know in theology, we say of Christ two things. We say that he is Savior and he's an example also, right? But he's first Savior, he's first Redeemer, and then he's example. So the fact that God enters into his creation without destroying it, he enters into it and gives us this picture of humanity in Christ. Paul talks about in Ephesians that we are to, I'm going to get this wrong. It's in Ephesians 5. Anyway, that the full stature, the measure of Christ is that what we're all striving to.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't believe I just messed that all up. But we're
well, it's not like we're live and everyone just saw that.
not at all. But that is the measure. That is the stature that we're striving to. Will we ever reach that here? No, we understand that, but that is what we're striving to in Christ, in the power of the Holy Spirit, word and sacrament, church,
Yes.
family. All of these things contribute to this, us realizing
Yes.
or striving toward this,
and realizing that the problem is not the humanity.
Correct.
Right? Because,
Yes.
Because Christ is perfect,
right?
And humanity is perfect in him.
Correct.
We are the problem,
Right?
But we want to strive towards learning more about. I mean, there's a sense in which we as human beings, we cannot separate theology from anthropology, from humanism, from human study.
Right, and that's what Christian humanism is doing. In a sense, is it's reclaiming even the humanity, in the redemption, from this sort of Gnosticism that permeates much of, frankly, much of 19th century fundamentalism, that has even, crept into the modern world. This idea that, we're going to be taken away somewhere, or we're not going to be, fully realized until we're in heaven. But God created us to live on this earth, and in our redemption, we will be resurrected in body.
Yes.
It's not this unembodied experience that our salvation is in. It's in a completely redeemed, humanity.
Yeah.
And so it's reclaiming even that, that idea.
That's a beautiful thought. Keep your comments coming, folks. So Wesley Santos commented that in the sciences as well, the church is the progenitor of science.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's been stolen, you could say.
Yep.
And so there's the same concern that many of the humanities have. Now, secularism kicked the gospel out of science and kept the structures and the knowledge built during Christian history. And I think that's true in so many fields.
Right.
I mean, certainly, like if we think about something that's more limited than something as broad and universal as humanism, the idea that children or women have great worth, have equal worth, is actually pretty unique in human history, and it's Christian.
It is absolutely. So this is what I find really remarkable, and Paul reclaims this. Okay, so you take the modern, the modern sentiment today, particularly in feminism, and so these, and the idea that Paul tells women, you can learn at home with your husbands. We think, how oppressive,
right.
And what Paul is saying in that context is, to
you can learn.
You can learn. Let's, for cultural reasons, you're going to learn from your husband at home and these things. But women are educable.
Right.
Now, what if we go back, and this is really fascinating. One of the reasons that it's great to read these great books is we see that Paul uses much of Socrates' language in a lot of his letters. There are sections from 1 Corinthians that are lifted right out of the Apology. So why is Paul doing that? Because he's writing to a Greek culture that knows the Apology. Okay, so he's using language in his rhetoric that they're going to completely understand. one of the fascinating things in 399 BC, when Socrates is executed, one of the reasons the charges are brought against him is he's corrupting the youth. Okay, corrupting the youth. Well, what is he corrupting the youth with? Well, one of the things is he said women are educable. Women should have an opportunity to have an education. That's corrupting the youth.
Gasp.
Yes. And so Paul introduces this idea. Paul, is saying absolutely in Christ. That's there. So, that's the kind of Christian humanism we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, so I would love to encourage you guys to pipe in with your questions and comments. And so what I'd like to do is circle back to a further exploration of Christian humanism, but I want to approach it through the line of your courses that your courses follow. So you're offering 4 classes this year,
correct?
All integrated humanities classes.
Right.
Maybe you could give us a short definition of what an integrated humanities course is.
Absolutely. So integrated humanities is, again, another redundancy, really, okay? Because the humanities, represent a big spectrum, everything from languages to history, imaginative literature, science, the arts, politics, any of these ideas that are associated with human beings, okay? What we as human beings, how we can flourish. So when we say integrated, though, we're again making a very particular statement about the integration. We're not separating geography, from the rest of the humanities, and we're only having a geography course. We're studying geography along with primary sources of history, imaginative literature, philosophy, and poetry. We're taking a look at all of these, human expressions of thought, in manifest in kinds of literature, and we're studying them, we're reading them, and we're looking at human beings and the development of human beings in the Western tradition, the human experience through these different kinds of literature. And we're not segregating. We're intentionally expressing the idea that all truth is one truth.
Yes.
Right? Which is where we get the idea of university, but all truth is one truth. And so it's all connected to God. And so we're looking, instead of separating these out and segregating them, we're looking at them holistically.
Right.
Okay. So we might read a piece of history, but then we might read literature at the same time of this piece of history that illustrates much of what the historians are recapping.
Right.
So,
and that's the philosophical beauty of an integrated humanities course. The practical beauty of an integrated humanities course for students and families is these classes are more work,
yes,
but they count for 3 credits.
correct.
So you take an integrated humanities course at Kepler, you get a credit of history, a credit of literature, and a credit of philosophy or theology.
Correct. That's exactly right.
So that's a pretty nifty deal.
It is. And they do, we have a very integrated writing component to this.
Yes.
So students are going to write 4 papers, 1 per quarter. And we work through invention, to final draft, from the very beginning with each of those papers, helping students think about some of the concepts that they, inevitably students come across some of these concepts and these are epiphany moments. And that's one of the greatest experiences as a teacher is when they go, oh, and they connect these dots. Well, this gives them an opportunity to explore that further. So they get to explore that through written composition, and they get help with that. So adding those three subjects, if you will, what would be in a typical setting, people would study those subjects separately. We're studying them together with a writing component and a Socratic dialogue, that goes with it.
Yeah.
And great lectures.
Wonderful. So let's talk about the career, to use the word in an alternative way to the principle, but yes, the career of your courses. How does you're teaching 4, they run the gamut chronologically. Maybe you could kind of introduce us to them.
Great. So the first year course is the Greeks. Okay, we're going to study Homer. All right, so we can't get away from, we can't study humanism, and we understand this is pre-Christian. Okay, but these thinkers are thinking about the human condition, thinking about the human experience, and the foundation of all literature in the Western tradition is Homer. Okay, this is, so we're going to read the Odyssey, we're going to read the Iliad, and some, I could talk about those works, forever, but fantastic works. And we're going to move into drama and lyric, some of, what is tragedy, what is comedy. We're going to look at some philosophy, we're going to look at some poetry, epic poetry, but then we're going to look at some lyric poetry and things. So we're going to study for 1 full year. We'll study the Greeks. Second year, we move into the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we pick up kind of where the Greeks left off. As the Roman Empire is expanding, starting in about 753 BC, it's becoming a world empire. By the time of the demise of the Greeks and Alexander the Great and all this, that empire's separated, and now we have the Roman Empire growing, and we'll begin reading literature all the way up into early Christian literature that is shaping the empire. So when Constantine comes on with the Milan Edict and allows Christianity not only to be legal, he legalizes all religion, but in a sense, Christianity becomes the premier religion, to the empire. So we'll read all the way up into Nicene Christianity and the Romans, and we read a lot of the church fathers there, and then we move into Christendom proper. Okay, and so we're looking at everything from medieval knights and kings, and reading things like Beowulf and other church fathers. We're going to come all the way into near the early modern period, right up to about the Renaissance and the Reformation. Then we pick up the early moderns and we move from Reformation into early modern. So we'll look at the scientific revolution, we look at the Age of Enlightenment, the pushback with the Romantics. And so really what we're doing, as Francis Schaeffer once said, that there's a flow to history. We're going to examine the flow to history and see how all of these movements have responded to each other, complemented each other. All kinds of things have happened here. It's really a great conversation. And we're going to start at the beginning and we're going to take it all the way in 4 years to the end.
Right.
Well, at least up to this period. The conversation's still going.
Yeah.
So,
understood. Yeah. And so, if I'm coming in as an 11th grader, I may want to, jump in midstream. I may want to, there's no reason I couldn't start with the Greeks.
Correct.
But there's sort of a cycle, sort of.
Yeah. So we go through that cycle. The best place to start, obviously, is with the Greeks and run through. But if you're an 11th grader and you haven't had any, experience in there, there'd be no reason you couldn't jump into Christendom. Okay, because we always reach back and talk about different things that are connected. But an 11th grader, I would say, start with Christendom. You're going to see and explore much of what we see as residual goodness in the modern world is left over from that period.
Yes.
Okay. What much people think the moderns claim, a lot of the modern secularists claim all this goodness. Look what science has accomplished. Science has done just the opposite, and we're going to see that. Well, let me back up. Not science, scientism.
Yes.
Okay, the worship of science without a human aspect to it has done just the opposite. So any goodness is residual of that period of Christendom, and it's a fabulous period to study. And then if I was a senior, I would definitely jump into the early moderns, because you can take a look at that.
Yeah.
You get to look at the rest of the spectrum kind of in hindsight.
Yeah. Well, I think that aspect alone of a good Christian humanities education is understanding that part of our heritage.
Absolutely.
Right? So often as Christian young men and women, we grow up believing that it's just us, just this generation,
right,
that's going through whatever the battle is, and it's not. And not only have we been around for a long time, and this story is being told, but we have been left a great legacy.
Absolutely.
And the world around us is full of that. It actually is very empowering and energizing to realize that, to look around and see signs of Christ's kingship, to see signs of the power of God, and that you're a part of that story.
You're exactly right. Everything from schools. And yes, there were schools obviously before Christianity, but the way education changed and significantly shaped the Western tradition, that's Christian influence. Hospitals, that's Christian influence. We read a letter from Pliny the Younger to Trajan, the emperor, a letter, one of the Roman letters, and talks about how these early Christians, what do we do with these guys? Okay, because they're not totally committed to the empire. But one of the things that makes them so strange is they collect all the babies. In the ancient world, postpartum abortion was a very normal thing.
Right.
Okay, so if you don't like the baby, you throw them off the cliff in the volcano, put them on a hillside, and let the animals or elements take them. And this is, horrific. But early Christians are adopting all these babies that aren't theirs, to the point where people are leaving. If they know they're a Christian, they just leave the baby on the Christian's doorstep. So, we see an early, picture of Christians loving human beings in a world that doesn't, to us, it doesn't make sense. To us, we would be horrified, if we found out people, did that to a baby. But the reason we're horrified is because of the Christian influence on our thinking.
Yep.
Prior to that, it's like, why waste your time with this, person
Yes.
of lesser value?
Well, and it forms our perspective as well. I think this is a part of that context that young Christians need. The world wants to tell us that when we oppose abortion, we are being ridiculous,
Right.
unreasonable, irrational. And knowing that you're part of a tradition, that we have irrationally been going to garbage heaps and collecting babies since we've existed.
That's exactly right.
Is an important part of it. It gives you strength to stand and say, well, you know what? It is ridiculous to you. God loves these babies, right. And we've always done this. Just the strength of that tradition.
Yes,
there are other arguments that you could lay out, but when you feel isolated, just chronologically, through time, we've been together forever. And so anyway, I think that's a cool aspect of studying not only history, but where are you going to see a letter like the one you just cited? Right? Is it going to be in a history course? Is it going to be, you have to study church history? Is it going to be in a course on rhetoric? Right? There's just, but if you're studying a Christian humanities course that is integrating just all fields of study, then you're going to see stuff like that and how they interact with each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's what you just said is fabulous. It's exactly right.
So if there are any humanities teachers watching, and I know there are, we'd love to hear some comments on what the joys of teaching humanities, and particularly integrated, are. Now, I'd like to kind of quiz you on, when you were introducing the sequence of courses, you kind of right away said, the Greeks, obviously pre-Christian, completely pre-Christian, but you can't have Western letters without the Greeks. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's one justification. But I have the feeling somehow that you'd have plenty more to say on why Christians should study the Greeks, or going all the way past the Christendom units into the moderns. Mm-hmm. Right? You have a lot of anti-Christians in that on that side of things as well. So what are the justifications for studying pagan thought, for studying the thoughts of philosophers who frankly have been against the Church of God?
Well, maybe one great place to start at the very beginning. Let's start with Homer. Mm-hmm. Okay. And Homer, when we read the Iliad, we come across, both in Iliad and then later in the Odyssey, we come across the Greek word for it is this thing called xenia. Okay. A xenos, singular, is a guest or a host in a relationship. Xenia is the experience of a guest-host relationship. Okay. And so to us, this is kind of, foreign. If you were just coming to Moscow and didn't really know anybody, you would look out and see kind of the station. What is your station in the caste system that they're used to? Okay. You wouldn't go to somebody super wealthy. You wouldn't go to somebody super poor, but you'd find where your station is and you'd go knock on their door. Mm-hmm. And say, I'm here and I'm from the tribe of whatever, and I'm traveling through. Would you give me lodging? Would you host? And as you came in, if of that station, they weren't allowed to ask your name. Okay, they would disarm you. You'd surrender all of your arms, and you knew the condition is you don't touch any belongings of the house, and you do not touch the women. Okay, under any circumstances, threat of death. Okay, mm-hmm. that's a capital offense. But at the same time, they feed you, they house you, they do not harm you under threat of death themselves. It brings judgment. Okay, this is a communal way of thinking about it. Okay, so this is called xenia, the guest-host relationship. And we see this undergirding all of Greek culture. We see in book 6 where all of a sudden Glaucon and, is facing this opponent. It's like, I don't recognize you. Take off your armor. What's your name? In the middle of this battle, spears shoving through people's heads and stuff. And they stop and he's like, well, I'm this person. I'm this. Hey, our grandfathers were xenia. we don't kill each other on the battlefield. You got plenty of Greeks and plenty of Trojans.
Well,
We don't kill each other. Let's exchange armor. And because this is a very, very important cultural basis, a way to love your neighbor. Okay. Now, what we find out in the Odyssey is Zeus is the god of Xenia. He is the god of the guest host relationship. And we discover this when Polyphemus doesn't receive Odysseus. And matter of fact, he's going to eat him. Instead of feeding him, he's going to eat his men. And I don't want to give it all away, but he's
I love that you're still trying to keep the spoilers out.
Right, so I don't want to give it
all these thousands of years later. Yeah.
But all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, and it causes you to go back through. There's this guest host relationship that is undergirding all of cultural society. This is the stability. And why do they say that they go to Troy? Because Helen was taken by Paris, right? Or Alexandros. He broke the guest host relationship. Right. Okay, just like Polyphemus, who is his father is not Zeus, is the water, Poseidon, sorry. And his father's Poseidon, and he says, I don't know Zeus. So he doesn't know God, and he doesn't love God, and he doesn't love his neighbor. There is this sort of, as you begin to look through it, you see this pre-Christian disposition to what do we owe the gods and what do we owe our neighbor. And what does Jesus say? That all of the commandments hang on these two, right. All the law and prophets. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we recognize Zeus isn't the god of the Bible. He's not. But there is within their humanity, their fallen humanity, who has been, many would argue, deceived by demonic, sub-demonic spiritual beings who may even represent some of these gods. But we see within humanity this innate part of worshiping God correctly and loving your neighbor correctly. That is the foundation of a social society, of a political union that has peace. Without it, what do we have? We have war. Yeah,
and there's an important aspect to our anthropology of how we think about and define man that in the modern period, which is the last set for your classes. People are trying to destroy or ridicule to destruction, which is that man was made to worship.
Right.
And, it's if Christians are saying that, then the evidence outside of the church, outside of, is an important part of that story, right? After the fall, what did men do? Right. Did they go out and look for that which to worship? Yeah, actually they did. And here's how it looked, and here are the impulses. And so that's an important part of, it. So there's actually a sort of sequence, you wouldn't have to only go to the Greeks, but there's a sort of sequence, in the West, certainly, where you can start there. You can talk about man's relationship to God and move to Jesus through the Greeks.
Absolutely. If we study Greeks correctly as Christians, what we're going to see is the Greeks in many ways set up the pagans to look for a Messiah. I'm using language borrowed from the Jews in the same way the Old Testament points to Christ coming.
Yes.
Okay. And I'll just throw, we could go to Plato's Republic. That was one of the books we'll read there. We'll read most of it, excerpts from it. But in Plato's Republic, Plato goes through this whole thing, makes a city to show the soul writ large. And what he comes to the conclusion is we need a philosopher king to rule us. And the kind of philosopher king has to be just. And the way we know he's just is he suffers the most injustice without ever being unjust himself. And if you ever find that man, make him your king. So, here's the whole Greek world. Who do we have? We, as Christians, in hindsight, we can look back and see that there's a sense in which, and it's not laid out as clearly because we're looking through the lens of our Christian worldview, but we can see that the pagans are anticipating something better. They're looking for something better, and they're looking for it in very specific ways, reasoning. And when Paul goes into Mars Hill, right, in Acts 17, what does he say? You've been groping toward God, but I'm here to declare to you the risen Christ. I'm here to declare to you, here's this unknown God. You've been groping.
Right.
And he uses that language. And that's kind of what we see happening in the Greeks. We see them groping toward God. Lewis, when we read in the latter years, in the early moderns, Lewis in it's an essay, but it was originally a lecture, De Descriptione Temporum, which is on the description of times. It's when he took the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge when he left Oxford to go there. And in that lecture, he argues that the point to divide time isn't where we typically do. But he says prior to about the age of Jane Austen, Walter Scott, prior to that time, man was completely different than man from this time forward. Man, whether you are Christian or pagan, shared more in common back then with each other than either one of those two shared in common with this modern man. Modern man has no concept of worship, of metaphysical. He wants, materialism, it's nihilism, complete, man's sovereignty. But even the pagans understood, even if their worship was misdirected, they understood that they were oriented toward worship and oriented toward political harmony and human interaction.
Right. And so that's an important part of the value of studying the Greeks and the Romans as we move into Christendom. But I'm glad you touched on the moderns. What's the value of, well, first of all, what is in the moderns class in Old Western culture? Because of course there will be many Christians, many Christians. But yeah, what's the value of moving our education into this age? Lewis's line is kind of in the middle, maybe, of what you might call the modern period.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to begin looking at the skeptics. All right, we start out with the skeptics, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment period, where man is no longer thinking about what does he's ontological in that. So we're looking at what is and why, the what is questions, right? What is reality? What we're asking. And then we move into, well, how can we even know? All right. And this leads us to our modern empirical, skeptical kind of mindset that has in many ways, although they tried to embrace this sort of empirical evidence, scientific method as a means of empirical, they don't really, they take parts of it and claim to own it. But the early Christians understood this. Even people like Francis Bacon understood this as a means of how do we follow, knowing that human reason is fallen, how do we follow out our thinking in a way that's verifiable? Okay. Well, now they move to how can we even know what we can know? How do I even know what knowledge is? How do I know as I'm sitting here, the reality that I see on the outside is even, what's actually out there? How do we know this isn't the Matrix? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the question that they're asking, and that begins to shape everything in the modern world. And one area that that we're kind of in now, and I think, I'm not a prophet, so I can't really say this for sure, I think we're coming to somewhat in the near future, even an implosion of this postmodern world. Some scholars have said maybe trying to identify what's the modern period. Maybe 1789, the storming of the Bastille, to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. There's a 200-year period we call modernism. This is modern thought being applied to humanity. But then we move into this postmodernism that is pushing back against these Enlightenment thinkers. So even though we don't get into postmodernism, we are taking a look at the world that our current culture is pushing back against.
Yes.
Right? And so we even get away, as Lewis said, we can't see the future, but by looking into the past, we can anticipate what we might see in the future. Yeah.
And certainly if we're correct in saying that man is primarily made as homo adorans, right? A worshiping creature, then that if with the push of postmodernism, if all of these modern trappings start to fall apart, modern thought falls apart, then the reset would be right. Whether it's pagan or Christian, the reset would be a worshiping one. Exactly. Right, because that's what man is fundamentally.
Well, Lewis even says that in that same line. He says everybody talks about us we're turning to paganism. He said that's a lie. We're not turning to paganism. We're turning to scientism. I wish we were turning to paganism. He said it would be great to see on Westminster steps a big white bull being sacrificed, before Parliament or something. He said, but we're not going to see that. He said because his idea was if we get back to paganism, that is a reset. Now we're at least oriented in the right direction. Right. Where Christianity is going to make sense.
And that actually, I think some people might have been scandalized by the idea of a white bull being sacrificed on the steps of a church. But I think it's really, it's such an important, there's one of the things that Christians have been allowed to be manipulated into is to think that the clinical is not sinful, right? We tolerate the sacrifice of infants because it happens in a sanitized environment. Right. We tolerate what has happened to the churches because it's sanitized, right? We would be scandalized if sacrificial blood were right, or if sorry. But yeah,
you're having one of those epiphany moments. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Let me. Edmund Burke has decided to join us.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa. Calling back from the.
Hey guys. Yeah. Hey guys, love what you're doing. Can you name some postmodern scholars that think the way you are describing? Now, I'm not sure when this comment went up, but I assume you mean pushing back against modernism. And remember, this is Edmund Burke, so you got to give a really good answer.
I know. I'm going to be hard pressed. I mean, obviously, there are Christian philosophers. I would say are the kinds of people who are doing this kind of work. Alvin Plantinga, I think, is doing a lot of work. I want to say, is it Bergson is doing some work in that area. Gene Vaith, I think he wrote a book on postmodern times that I think is it's very simplistic. I mean, it's a very simple, probably high school, early college level reading, but I think it lays out some good thought there. I want to say Henry Bergson, and I may have that name wrong. He wrote a book, and it's called. Oh goodness, I'm drawing a blank on it, but it's something like Signals of Transcendence. How in this modern world that there are still, signals, things that signal us to, this transcendent, realm in which man worship. We're not just material, and things that permeate our everyday life that we sometimes dismiss. Different kinds of, miracles, even like birth. Even the idea of why is it that even, this is my rendition of it. Why is it that even, proclaimed atheist is like, well, the universe is against me. I'm asking the universe to help me. Well, but why is there that orientation? That even though you say there isn't, it's innate in the human being. And so I think some of these, would be people that I might point to that are working there. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe you know off the top of your head some that.
Well, I mean, I think some names like Peter Kreeft might pop up. But I think that another way to answer that question, because you were answering in a constructive and positive way, which is so nice. But there's also there are the philosophers who have completely undermined modern thought, right? Modern positivism.
Yes. So you're talking about some of like Sartre and some of these.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Derrida and Foucault.
Yep.
There's not only the positive work that Christians always do to build and to create, but there is a fracturing.
Correct.
And the fracturing isn't just that people have stopped being able to think, is that thinkers are busy tearing things down.
Correct. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. As they're tearing this apart in a postmodern world, it's really just about, we all have a narrative and they all have this equal standing. So I think it's a really good time for Christians, to become Christian humanists, Christians to engage this, this conversation, informed and understanding of the flow of history, the flow of philosophy, understanding it well so that we can, have a conversation and show how. From east to west, this is one thing that all traditions within Christianity share, is understanding how the incarnation reshaped history. I mean, it changed it fundamentally. It's like a stick being stuck into water and it looks like it's bending. I mean, the incarnation bent human history in a way that has put us on the trajectory we're at. So even as these are deconstructing this modernist idea as a pushback against it, and even though their motivations are wrong in it's showing, that human enlightenment doesn't, really, doesn't add up. This is a good time for Christians to be able to step up and speak out and show how Christianity does answer these questions.
Right.
The answers are there in Christianity and nowhere else.
Yes. Oh, and it's certainly a better time than 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when Westerners were sure
Mhm.
right?
Right. Right.
You know, sure to perdition, but sure.
Sure. Yes.
And now nobody's sure.
Nobody knows.
So let's
yeah.
stand up and witness.
Yes.
And you can be equipped to stand up and witness with Scott Postma's classes.
Yeah. Love to have you.
Thanks for doing this. As always, it's been a ton of fun. We've been doing some vlogs, promoting the summer classes coming up. We can register for summer classes today.
Yes.
But yeah, we've been having fun just hanging out together and doing stuff like this.
This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Thanks, Josh.
thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so long, everybody.